All right, everybody, how's it going? I hope it goes well. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and I thank you so much for doing so. We've got a great show for you today. You know, as many of you know, I'm a bit of an American historian. I studied the 1960s and 1970s, and I wrote a book called Dangerous Grounds about the GI coffeehouse movement of that era. And in doing research for that book, I realized that there was this whole world of activist storefronts and businesses that ranged from feminist bookstores and black-owned bookstores to head shops and organic food markets. Before our world became a sort of corporate consumer nightmare hell, there was an opportunity for a different kind of business reality. And it came out of the counterculture, and it came out of the New Left, and it came out of groups of people who were trying consciously and explicitly to move capitalism into a different area. And it's something that I think needs to be thought about a lot more, especially as we're entering into this era in which there is this shell of brick and mortar stores, this skeleton that's going to be left to us, especially accelerated through the pandemic, and perhaps an opportunity to build something akin to this world again. Because my guest today is someone who tracks what happened to this world. He wrote an amazing book. His name is Josh Davis. He's a professor of history at the University of Baltimore, and his book is called From Head Shops to Whole Foods: The Rise and Fall of Activist Entrepreneurs. And this conversation is great because I got to ask him all the questions that I'd wanted to ask. Ever since I've been thinking about and writing about GI coffee houses, I've thought a lot about this whole world of small businesses that sort of are operating on a different kind of scale and a different sort of set of values. So we had a really, really engaging conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you like what we do on Nostalgia Trap, go ahead and subscribe to the show and support us at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We've been having a series of conversations with Dan Bessner lately that for me have been really compelling and really always are some of my favorite part of the week is sitting down with Dan and talking to him about politics and history. So if you want to get in on that, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And we always appreciate the people that are supporting us because we have no other support on this show other than our wonderful listeners. So enjoy this conversation. Here is my talk with Josh Davis. Okay, Josh Davis, thanks so much for joining us. We like to do academic origin stories on this program, and seeing the name of your book, I just wanted to know more about where you came to this idea, because I just want to say it right at the front of the show. The name of your book is called that caught my attention. Is called From Head Shops to Whole Foods: The Rise and Fall of Activist Entrepreneurs. So those the people that listen to this show know that I wrote a book called Dangerous Grounds about GI coffee houses, and I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and I'm wondering, was this, first of all, thanks for joining us, but was this did this emerge from your graduate work? Was this like a dissertation that you turned into a book? And if so, how did you come to this idea? I know that's kind of a big question, but
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, David.
For
it's
sure.
Great to be here. I'm a fan of your book. And yeah, I think that it's a good conversation to have between two people who've done work on some very complementary topics. So, to answer your question, it's a bit of a roundabout way, but when I was in college, I actually did German history and German studies, and I went to grad school for history actually doing German history for my first year. And I only bring that up because my original topic that I was working on was going to be the history of vegetarians in Germany around 1900, which sounds like totally bonkers, off the wall topic. But actually, Germany, of all places, had a really big vegetarian and organic food community. Not only pre-Nazi, pre-World War I. But what I discovered, I think, for a number of reasons, is that I was more interested in U.S. history, but that I ended up switching fields, but that I was still had a very strong interest in counterculture. And I had a very strong interest, I think, in the 1970s. So this did grow out of my dissertation, and I started grad school in 2003. And at that time, the 70s was, very little had been written on it so far. A few things had been written on it. Bruce Schulman's book had just come out recently. People were just bringing out stuff in the mid and late 2000s on the 70s. So part of like what I was thinking through, I think, was that one, I was very interested in countercultures. I was interested in food. I was interested in consumer culture. And I was especially interested in how Americans in the 1970s lived out some of the messages and ideologies of the movements of the 60s. And what appeared to me to be a process by which movement ideologies filtered into consumer marketplaces, sometimes being severely compromised by that diffusion, sometimes by virtue of getting into the marketplace, maybe having a really big, meaningful impact. So that's kind of what it was in a nutshell. But the way I'm describing it, it took me years to put all of that together.
Yeah, I feel the same way. So I think we're a similar track in a lot of ways, but even in time. I mean, I started graduate school in 2004, and very much identified with Bruce Schulman's book, which had just come out. And it's funny, I had to kind of get a lay of the land of the historiography and find out just from talking to other professors and students that, yeah, the 70s weren't really, didn't really have a huge historiography yet. And that there was this sort of period where the just like you're kind of suggesting that the 70s were a moment where there were a lot of projects that were put together that like almost you can see the continuation of the 60s and the 70s. But I'm wondering also, in terms of just these businesses, were these businesses around you when you were growing up? Did you see? Because I feel like if you're of a certain age, you did see a little bit of this stuff. And I know at different points in my life, I've come across some of these businesses, but were they a part of your life at all? Did you think about them even like before graduate school?
Yes, and they were on my mental landscape, so to speak. I didn't really grow up patronizing most of these stores. For example, I didn't really go to health food stores as much as I was aware of their existence, and they stood out as something kind of strange.
We don't even use the word health food store anymore, right? It's funny because there is one in my town called Lassen's, and it's like health and vitamin shop, and it really is like a total throwback. Like it feels like from another era entirely. Like even the term health food seems so dated, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very antiquated. In fact, it's even more antiquated than what came after that, natural foods, which you don't really hear anymore anyways.
That's right.
But I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta. And so there was a place called Rainbow Natural Grocery. In Atlanta, there was a place called Sevenanda Natural Foods. There were head shops that, stood out kind of like sore thumbs, especially the ones that were in suburban strip malls. They just, you could see that they were different. I would say one thing that also shaped me was that I think one of the very first stores that I became a regular at, where I felt like I was treated as a customer, as kind of a emerging adult, was a black-owned record store called Vibes Music and More. And I didn't end up writing about black-owned record stores for this book, but I did write about black-owned bookstores. And I think that, this was a tiny little shoebox of a store where this was in the 90s, there was a owner, and his name was Jay Warren. He was very hip and was a DJ who opened a record store. And he would talk to, kids from our high school who were going to shop there kind of more as a peer. As opposed to, when you're 15, 16, you're just beginning to buy things on your own. You don't really buy groceries or other things on your own. So that was kind of a socialization process for me. And that was the first time I think where someone in a store treated me as a regular customer, as a repeat customer who kind of knew my taste. And it's also, this record store was really kind of a hip hop and R&B record store, which in the 90s, that was obviously becoming pop culture, but was still very much part of a subculture, much more than today.
Yeah.
So I think that was part of the mix of what was going on with me.
Yeah, it's
long term.
Yeah, it's funny that you describe those places as like being socially important, because that's what I felt like almost, that what makes these stores, these kind of places special, was that you wanted to actually hang out there, or like just go there and be in the space, and not just like go there and buy what you need and leave. And that definitely resonates with me. And like the head shop in town that my parents were like very much against me going to was called Wild Planet, and it just closed, and now it's like a shitty jewelry store, which sucks. But it had it was the classic like head shop with Jimi Hendrix posters and like all that 60s culture. But they also had and this is like from the 90s, they had cassettes of like lectures from Noam Chomsky and Che Guevara, and like they had like there was like an actual explicit connection to left-wing politics too, which is something that I feel like is like you're identifying, like it's a trend that's gone away. You don't see that nearly as much.
Exactly. And I think that would have been pretty unusual even by the 90s.
Yeah, totally.
To have left-wing materials at a lot of head shops. I mean, the other one I'll just mention, which I didn't really shop at as a kid, but I write about it in the book. It's called Wind Fair, and it was in suburban DeKalb County, right near where I lived. And it was, in this kind of crappy suburban strip mall. And I remember my dad pointing it out to me one time and saying, yeah, that was, the source of all these major legal debates and cases. And the county and state tried to shut this thing down. And it kind of became a national poster child for the evils of drug paraphernalia. And it just happened to be down the road. And those events had been really in the late 70s and early 80s. But that head shop, I mean, miraculously had outlived, and I write about it in the book, outlived all kinds of injunctions and raids. And raids that are broadcast live on the local news, and just somehow it survived for decades after that.
Yeah, it's weird. I think young people today kind of take for granted that you can just go buy like pipes and bongs and stuff like that. But even at this place, Wild Planet, they had big posters everywhere that said for tobacco use only, because they had to advertise that it was just not a drug thing, even though everyone kind of knew that. And yeah, the legal line of it. I wonder, maybe we can start with head shops, because that was what obviously caught my attention. But there are so many different types of stores and types of businesses that you write about in your book. But in terms of head shops, I get my conventional wisdom would say that it maybe emerged out of San Francisco. Is that true? And how did head shops kind of take off? Right. I imagine it's happening in the mid 60s, somewhere in there.
Yes. And the story couldn't have worked out better for me in terms of using head shops as a way to talk about the history of the counterculture, because the first documented head shop was in San Francisco in the Haight. Mm-hmm. It opened in January 66. And it ended up closing in late 67. And it barely survived the Summer of Love. But it was two brothers, Ron and Jay Thielen. And, one thing that came up in my research that was interesting to me is that I didn't intuitively note this, but really the head shops that emerged in San Francisco and in California, for a number of years, they were known better as psychedelic shops. And head shop was more of an East Coast terminology. So there were a few head shops that emerged in New York, probably in 66. And I think even one of them was called The Head Shop, that came out of the East Village. And, maybe it opened only a few months after the psychedelic shop. But you kind of had those two terminologies existing, so that, there are LA Times stories about psychedelic shops at least through 69, 70. That's the terminology for it. At some point, head shop kind of becomes a dominant phrase. But yeah, it came out of the Haight. And what's interesting about Ron and Jay Thielen is that head shops very quickly became a public space for anti-war organizing and just for various kinds of community organizing that people were doing. They didn't really call themselves hippies. I mean, I think people like the Thielens, the real pioneers in the hate, saw that as a media term and didn't like it. But the original hippies, they were really clustered around the psychedelic shop and kind of became one of the top public spaces in the hate in 66 and 67.
It's interesting how the drug culture intersects with the left-wing politics and the anti-war stuff. Like that's an association that I feel like was just so natural and happened like everywhere during the 60s. But it, like in today's drug culture, and there's a like psychedelic drug culture, I think like a lot of people like listen to Joe Rogan and sort of like, are into like UFC fighting or something. In other words, it's not automatic that you like are into doing psychedelics and that you would be a lefty even. But it seems like that was really strong in San Francisco in this period.
It was extremely strong. And it's a complicated topic because if you talk to lots and lots of people who lived through that era, I would say the average American who lived through the 60s as a baby boomer, they often describe the drug culture and that new left culture as being intertwined, if not synonymous. I think what happened is, academic historians by the 80s and 90s started treating them as though they were two very separate things. And I think on the one hand, the kind of the lay people's understanding was overly simplistic. But then academic historians, I think, took it in too strong of a direction as though those were discrete phenomena. And it's a complicated Venn diagram between what's going on in the new left and left movements and then what's going on in the countercultures. And the San Francisco scene was very particular. I think the San Francisco area, the Bay was really an area in which there was overlap, but you could kind of be very, very political and not be into drugs, or be really into drugs and not political. And most cities weren't that way. Like the scenes were not big enough in most parts of the US where you could kind of be into one and totally not into the other. Right.
I wonder, I'd never really thought about that term head as coming from the East Coast, but it seems like it makes sense. I mean, when I hear that term head, in terms of the people that were using it at the time, it's generally like, how would you describe that term? Because it seems like head actually kind of indicated a whole range of things.
Right. So that term head goes back at least to the 30s.
Wow.
And kind of jazz terminology. And I think you're right that it's more of an East Coast phenomenon. But that was something I learned in the process of researching this book, is that, people are talking about hop heads and reefer heads in the 30s. That's really kind of, jazz cat slang.
Right.
That hadn't crossed over into, the real public eye, but it lived on. And I think the beatniks, the Beats are really an important bridge between that jazz world and the hippie world. And I think the Beats in so many different ways kind of gave certain kind of cultural and intellectual tropes that the hippies ran with. And I would not be surprised at all. Like, let's do a control F search of how often the term head comes up in all of Kerouac and Ginsberg's writings. I would think at least some.
Yeah. And I mean, in my research, I found that Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, was often referred to in the later 60s and early 70s by GIs as Fort Head because of the availability of marijuana around the base, and it was just like known that you could smoke there. So Fort Head seemed like it was like people knew that terminology by the later part of the war for sure.
It definitely became synonymous with someone who does drugs. I mean, by the late 60s, right. That's what it means. But it has a larger impulse. It has a larger claim also of not just someone who does drugs, but someone who is intent on expanding their consciousness. Right.
Yeah. Right.
So
what were they selling at these brothers, these Thalen brothers in their psychedelic shop? What did they have there? Because it seems like it was, like you're saying, it's like part drug culture, but also like something else. There's some kind of like just culture or point of view that they're selling.
Right. So they kind of have the things that you would expect. They have rolling papers and pipes. They had, multicolored posters. They had things like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. They had various Buddhist and Hindu kind of paraphernalia, I would say, which, I think there's a whole interesting debate about the appropriation inherent in how the American counterculture embraced Asian religion. But they kind of brought those things together. It wasn't nearly as commercial as today. It certainly wasn't like an anti-war movement headquarters, but they also were open to having some anti-war literature there. So, I think they had poetry readings there. There's a really interesting documentary that, I think it's KCET. It's one of the local San Francisco TV stations did in 1967. And it's like a 30-minute documentary on the hate. And
I love that footage.
They go down there and they just show the scene. And I mean, there's literally people just sitting on the floor. I mean, people are really hanging out there. And the beat poet, I'm forgetting his name, Michael Murphy? I'm forgetting his name, but he was a really big time San Francisco beat poet. He was very connected there. There's a lot of connection to poetry, to poets and writers also at this shop.
Yeah, and I mean, bookstores is like I feel like connected to. I mean, even thinking about beat poetry, I'm thinking about City Lights bookstore as being sort of more than a bookstore, kind of a cultural institution. And I mean, I'm wondering about, because it seems like San Francisco is sort of a generating zone for a lot of these ideas. When I think about, even the like Black Power bookstores you're talking about might have been, in around Berkeley and Oakland and places like that. But how much, in other words, how much of your story takes place in San Francisco, and how does that stuff spread to the rest of the culture?
San Francisco and the larger Bay Area was hugely important for this story. I think I always knew that as I was researching it, but I really felt that when I did my first on the ground research trip to San Francisco and to LA. I think that, all the businesses I'm looking at grew out of movements, and they tended to emerge first in the biggest cities. I think what's special about San Francisco is that, by the 50s and especially in the 60s, it does have this strong quality as a very much a beat city, and then as a hippie city. And so I think what's a little different about what's going on there, something like the psychedelic shop, in some ways, the businesses I looked at, they drew on the legacy of things like communist bookstores, which were all over major U.S. cities. But this variation of kind of merging some left politics with countercultural stuff, that was pretty unusual, I think. And I think, even going back to the 20s and 30s, California was really the undisputed organic food capital of the country going back then. Obviously, it's the agricultural capital of the U.S. in some ways. But we were just talking about health food. Health food was something that was a fad in the 20s in LA. So that's going on. There are actual old school organic farmers in California prior to the hippies. There's not a lot, but there's some. So there's kind of in terms of food, there's an infrastructure. In terms of counterculture, there's an infrastructure that exists in the Bay Area that I don't think exists even in places throughout the U.S. other than maybe New York. And in New York, it's a very different thing because I would say the old left, or the kind of traditional left, is so big in New York that I think it took away some of the space possible for a place like the psychedelic shop maybe at first.
Yeah. God, it makes me think about this word counterculture and kind of what, because I use it a lot. I mean, it's obviously what I'm interested in as well, but my project was about like specific political projects that were kind of using the counterculture as a sort of way to draw people in. They wanted to like put up posters of Bob Dylan and play cool music and have like underground newspapers and kind of almost like kind of draw people into the left-wing politics through the counterculture, if that makes sense. But I'm wondering if you encountered that in other in other things that you talk about in the book, because I wonder what that connection is between counterculture and anti-capitalism, because there's this idea, what is a counterculture? There's like it seems like the common story we tell about the 60s and the 70s is this counterculture that like sort of is absorbed by capitalism. But maybe it was capitalism all the whole time. I'm not really sure. I'm wondering how that interplay comes out in the stuff you looked at, because it seems like your story, even in the title of your book, From Head Shops to Whole Foods, is really telling the story of how an activist entrepreneur movement turns into a pure capitalism.
It's complicated. I think one of the major points I wanted to make in the book was to say most businesses are capitalist, but to varying degrees, and not all businesses are capitalist. Most historians, if you ask them when capitalism started, maybe they're going to say the late 1700s in England. Maybe they're going to go a few centuries earlier and say European colonial mercantilism. But businesses go back thousands and thousands of years. I think one of the defining features of capitalism is the central focus on accumulation, on capital accumulation, which describes most businesses, but doesn't describe all businesses. There are low profit businesses. There are no profit businesses. There are people who start businesses simply to pay the bills. So a lot of the activist businesses I was looking at least through the 60s, certainly some of them did want to make profits, but most of them didn't want to make big profits. And I think that's what I wouldn't say makes them uncapitalist, but maybe makes them less capitalist. The story I tried to tell was that as we get into the 70s, then more and more people realize how much money you can make off drug paraphernalia, how much money you can make off organic food, to a lesser degree, how much money you could make off of Black authored literature and so-called feminist products. But one of the books I was responding to was Thomas Frank's The Conquest of Cool.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Book. Yeah. And I think that was written in 99. It was still relatively new when I started grad school. It's a really important story about how Madison Avenue and Fortune 500 companies discovered the counterculture and then tried to milk it for all of its worth. I always thought that book, however, was really the story. It was kind of like the bird's eye view from Don Draper's 50th Story corner office.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like that book was used by the people who wrote Mad Men in part to tell that same story of Madison Avenue executives figuring out that the counterculture was a way to refresh capitalism in the stale years after the 1950s and 60s. Yeah, that's a very common story. It's a good book. But but go on. I think I love your angle on it.
I think what I realized in reading it is that was an important story, but it was far from the complete story. No one's going to write the complete story in an academic monograph based on a dissertation, and that's what Thomas Frank was doing. But I do think there are parts of that book that really overstated. I don't want to say it made claims about comprehensiveness, but I think in some ways Frank told that story as this is the story of the counterculture in business. I think that, for me doing primary source research, for example, through underground papers, which you referenced.
Yeah, for sure.
You could read through these underground papers and just see that there was an incredible marketplace of local goods and local stores in every metro area. And we know like every major city by at least 69, 68 had one street or one block, and that was the hippie area. It wasn't just the Haight. It wasn't just the East Village. I mean, it's all over the country. It's like Kansas City has one. Atlanta had 14th Street. Little, college towns like Chapel Hill had Franklin Street. These places kind of became clusters of these businesses. And I think one of the stories that I wanted to tell was the people who opened these businesses, who came out of the hippie counterculture, who came out of the Black Power movement, who came out of the feminist movement. They had a very different understanding of what it meant to open a storefront than, say, the Fortune 500 companies. Some of them didn't even think they were business people. Some of them didn't think what they were doing was business. I tended to think, well, it is a business, but it's a very different kind of business. But I really came down to feeling we've got to understand how they saw themselves. This tremendous number of people who came out of these movements and said, starting a storefront is going to be a way that we can promote our movements, that we can get our ideologies out, that we can be storefronts for recruiting, that we can promote movement ideologies and how we run businesses. Like that story was missing, I think, not only from Conquest of Cool, but I felt like it was missing from the literature at large. And that goes back to what I said about when I started grad school. To me, this became one of the main ways that the movement diffused its ideals into the marketplace from the late 60s through the 70s.
Yeah, and it didn't seem like there was a centralized plan behind that. It's just something that happened. But I'm thinking about, like, because I lived in New York for a long time, and living in Washington Heights and being working in Harlem, seeing these Black-owned bookstores, and not only that, but the legacy of the sort of Black Power political third world, anti-colonial, revolutionary element of that, like even on the streets of like dudes in dashikis, like in, the 2000s selling, literature that was political literature. And it seemed like, they were selling these things for 50 cents, $1, but mainly it seemed like they just wanted to be present on the street and talking to people about this stuff. Like it was, you can really strip it down to like, this is far less a business and more like, a sort of like tabling, almost like like the way you would see tabling at any college campus, a sort of place that's meant to disseminate the literature because there's a political purpose to it. That part of it, yeah, you have to look for it now. It seems like like a storefront. Even, I mean, I think about this opening stores like this still because I love these things, but like it seems like opening a storefront and the rent is higher than ever before. It seems like a really, really intense market to get into now, and maybe that explains why we don't see these things as much.
I mean, you're saying two things that really are making me think. To go with your last point, part of why this era was so conducive to these businesses was the proliferation of movements. Part of it was that the economy was very, very strong and unemployment was very low. And part of it was that white people are doing a mass exodus from cities, and the rents are going way down, and people can get cheap commercial rents in cities and in college towns because all these, middle class and upper class businesses have decamped for the suburbs. But, to your point about tabling, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that's spot on. In some ways, these storefronts were the next step after tabling.
Right.
It's like, I promise you, if we look at activist businesses in Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco circa 1970, I promise you, a number of them had been involved in the free speech movement. I mean, literally, I think there is an element of this that is like tabling in that, in Harlem, as you mentioned, Louis Mashaw was the country's most famous Black-owned or Black bookseller from the 30s to the 70s. He was really of a previous generation by the 60s, but he got championed by the Black Power movement. But his original store in Harlem for decades was I want to say it's 125th and Lenox, I believe, was the corner. But it was known as Speaker's Corner because it was just where any variety of black leftists, nationalists, and any number of other radicals would step up on a soapbox and hold impromptu public rallies. And that was right outside of the store.
I think that's a I just watched the Spike Lee Malcolm X a couple weeks ago. I hadn't seen it in a while, and I think that they portray exactly that, which is because they have a big shot of the bookstore in Harlem, and then like the literal soapboxes, and not only soapboxes, but like different soapboxes that are like different groups, like a robust, diverse political sort of speaking center happening right outside the bookstore.
Right. Yeah. And actually, I haven't seen that movie in a long time. I'd like to see that scene now because. I mean, Malcolm X really was very, very close with Louis Michal. Malcolm X's role as a public speaker at that corner was really nurtured by Michal, and they were personal friends. And the bookstore became almost like I don't want to say a clubhouse, but it became a place where I think Malcolm could hang out maybe before talks or after talks, and there was a real tight connection there.
Yeah, I think about that. I mean, when I was in graduate school, obviously I wanted to like study the 20th century, but they make you learn the whole breadth of American history, which luckily isn't that long a history. But one of the things that really struck me and I think connected with the stuff we're talking about right now is that I remember reading about like tavern culture during the Revolutionary War and the sort of like these places where in cities and small towns even where there were places where men drank beer, but there were also places that held a really, really important social and political purpose because people got together and advocated positions there and even made decisions about what to do regarding the war. And they even during the war became almost like little command centers here and there, but had a real ideological purpose. I'm trying hard to think about like where these places are now. I feel like there's a thirst. I know it's a pandemic age, so that's a whole other challenge, but it feels like there's a hunger for that sort of place now, and because we kind of need that.
I think what's been interesting for me is that I started this project in the mid 2000s, and it took over a decade to get it in print. But I think in the last couple of years. So the book came out 2017. I would say definitely by 2015, 2014, kind of maybe in the wake of Occupy, Obama's second term, things going on, the emergence of Black Lives Matter.
That's right.
Kind of, there's been a resurgence of the left in those years in the U.S. But I think also at the very same time was the constant march of online culture and the growing dominance of social media in our country's, public life. And on the whole, that has not been very good for bookstores, for bricks and mortar businesses, as we know. But I think by the mid 2010s, there became clear that there were signs of a resurgence. So, for example, with independent bookstores as a rule started getting hurt in the late 90s or mid 90s by Barnes and Noble and Borders. And then Amazon emerged and that just hammered them. And then things like Kindle emerged and e-readers, and then the terrible recession of 2008, 9, 10. Those are really bad years for independent bookstores.
Yeah.
But if we look at independent bookstores from 2010 to 2020, their numbers bottomed out, but they've been growing. The number of independent bookstores has been going up for at least 5 or 6 consecutive years. And I think it's like a growing part of the American public that wants some element of community to accompany their experience as shoppers. And the public spaces where they can meet like-minded people, maybe be exposed to new ideas. There's something in which a informed store owner or a clerk can expose you to new ideas. That's different than just the suggestions you get on Amazon.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think people have woken up to that. I don't think most people have woken up to that, but I think growing numbers of Americans want something like that. Maybe not all the time, but they don't want to be simply wedded to these online businesses without a human connection.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic brings out that what's bad about that and what's horrible about that even more so. And maybe, I mean, that's my constant refrain so far, if I have to have any hope, it's that, you know, the pandemic is kind of clarifying in sort of like what people value about those sort of places. But I mean, even, you know, before the pandemic, my wife and I have been traveling up to the Yucca Valley here in California, up in the desert, and there's like a strip up there on 29 Palms Highway of like counterculture, and it really looks like, you know, it really looks like the kind of things we're talking about. There's a dude up there that has like a warehouse that it's like kind of it's just a big space where people do music. There's books and records, and there's a little coffee in the back, and it really is a sort of like place that seems like it's centering the social experience more than anything else. And they just get tons of people up there. I mean, it's obviously been interrupted by what's going on, but it does seem like there's a desire. But I wanted to talk about beyond the social and political part of it. You write about food, and like food seems like, you know, you talk about like from head shops to Whole Foods. I mean, I use Whole Foods in my classes all the time as kind of just a joke, to like a quick example to say, look at Whole Foods as like the corporate, you know, the most corporate kind of end of a lot of the changes that happened around food and culture in the 1960s and 70s. But it's a complicated thing, you know, and I'm wondering, yeah, I didn't realize that I mean, what you mentioned about like food being, you know, health food being popular in the 1920s. Can you tell me a little bit more about like where that comes from? Because it seems like I often think of vegetarianism as you know, in America, getting popular in the 60s and 70s.
It did. The 60s and 70s is when organic food really booms. But there was this older generation of the so-called health food stores, and it grew out of these really old school first wave of vegetarians that I think I referenced in Germany. I mean, the first vegetarian organization in the world is founded in London in, I think, the 1870s. And it's a real avant-garde counterculture, for lack of a better term. Past 1900, I think what happens in the 20s, especially in a place like Southern California, is that bodybuilding takes off, weightlifting takes off. You know, health culture. There's a way in which show business kind of, even today, very much fuels like kind of experimental health cultures. And so that was going on in the 20s and 30s in California. And like I mentioned, or as we know, so much agriculture in California, right? But by the 50s, I think those folks were, I don't want to say they were considered kooks. But they were considered kind of older and out of the mainstream, which is different than being like an 18-year-old hippie.
Right.
The thing that happens is that this guy, J.I. Rodale, who was a Jewish guy from New York who grew up on the Lower East Side, he got deeply into organic food in the teens and 20s and ended up starting a publishing empire and started Organic Gardening magazine, which I think starts publishing in 41 or 2, somewhere around there. And by the late 50s, probably has a circulation of over 50,000. I mean, it's, you know, that's a period in which someone like Life magazine has like over 1 million. But still, it's a significant magazine. I think it even hits 100,000 circulation by the early 60s.
Why is he promoting organic food? What is the because I know there are many different entryways into vegetarianism and veganism, but
it's not an animal rights thing for him. It's really much more of a health thing. And there is kind of a romantic agrarian element to it, but it's a health thing. And also, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of people who were involved in health food, organic food through that period had like a family background, if not Jewish, Central and Eastern European. And he was part of that. I believe he was Russian, but there was like, there were kind of currents of organic food and organic agriculture that kind of lived on, I think, longer in Europe than in the US. I mean, everyone used to eat organic food and grow organic food.
Right.
The idea of an organic food movement is really an idea that couldn't have existed until wide scale agricultural industrialization.
That's what I was wondering. It's a reaction to what's happened with food. Yeah. Okay.
And he's a big part of that. And I think a lot of times in the 50s, these folks and 60s, these folks were dismissed as kooks, as anti-modern, anti-technology, kind of the way we would talk about anti-vaxxers today.
Yeah.
I think they had some of those ideas too, but they also had some really important ideas and some important kind of ahead of their time caution about chemicals in food, about the dangers of DDT, about the dangers of, I mean, he's got 100,000 readers in his organic gardening magazine before Rachel Carson even prints Silent Spring in 1962.
Wow. Yeah.
So they're ahead of what's happening with the environmental movement.
That's what I was thinking because of all the things that you profile, from feminist bookstores and feminist businesses and Black-owned bookstores, head shops and psychedelic shops. The food seems like it touches on something so much bigger in some ways. You know what I mean? And what I don't mean that those subjects aren't important. I think they're arguably as important as food. But I just mean in terms of a market. Like in terms of what people go and buy, food is something obviously everyone needs, and that discourse seems like it became really, really powerful in the 70s. It seems like that's when all this stuff kind of exploded. I mean, I came of age in the 80s as a little kid, and it was everywhere in Southern California, and I even include, and I don't know if you would agree, but like Trader Joe's is like like. As much as they're in the news now for refusing to change the names of their products, that I associated that as like a hippie store when I was growing up.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, if we're talking about the 1980s and the major national grocery store chains, whether it's Safeway or Kroger, A&P, it varies on where you are in the country. Those places didn't really sell tofu. They didn't really sell organic produce. I mean, they definitely didn't have whole sections devoted to that stuff. And so my understanding is a place like Trader Joe did sell some of that stuff that far back. What happens with organic food is that it just gets tremendous momentum from the environmental movement.
Yeah.
And there were earlier waves of environmentalism, but environmentalism really kind of blows up in the late 60s and 70s. Obviously, the first celebration of Earth Day in 1970 is kind of the big way to mark that milestone. But even in the late 60s, I mean, there's this growing concerns about oil spills, about nuclear energy, and about chemicals in food. That connects also to concerns about chemicals deployed as weapons in warfare, right? DuPont, napalm, that kind of stuff. So natural food sellers are kind of benefiting from that. And I think you're right. There's something more elemental about natural food. There's something that people are talking about in the late 60s and 70s as if you can totally revolutionize your diet and your daily intake of food, you can totally revolutionize yourself in our culture, right? Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be a way of broader, deeper cultural change that goes beyond traditional movement politics.
And in terms of Whole Foods, I mean, when I think about Whole Foods, it's like, okay, who shops at Whole Foods now? What is it about? When you go to Whole Foods, like, why do you go? And like, I was like, when Whole Foods came to Brooklyn, which I think is their biggest store, I was sort of like, it's so weird because I was like, oh, this is going to be a place where I can get like access to like a whole lot of good food, but you pay a lot more money for it. And I'm like, I'm wondering, like, what is Whole Foods really selling? In other words, because before it's kind of like this notion of like, okay, you shop here, you get this food, you might even pay a little extra for it, but you know that the food is like well made. It's sourced well, it's organic food. Animals didn't suffer for the making of it. People didn't suffer. But also there's this notion of like you're making the world a better place. Also, you're like not contributing to it. So it's like, but Whole Foods doesn't. It's weird because it's like it sells that, but it sells it in a very surface sort of way. It sells it in a very like I wonder, like, is it true? In other words, does it like, are you a better person if you shop at Whole Foods? Because I'm not sure what. In other words, it's like a really mixed message that's being sent there.
If that message were true, our country would probably be a better place because a lot of people would be a lot better for shopping there. But as you're right, it's. I think one of the things I really wanted people to understand from my book is that Whole Foods came out of a very different political and cultural movement and became something very different from where it started.
Mm-hmm.
Austin, Texas, where the University of Texas is, of course, which in some ways was really one of the country's countercultural capitals. I mean, it really was up there with Berkeley, with Madison, and with the large cities. In terms of how many activist groups were there, how many hippies there were, just period. And John Mackey and his then partner, their original natural food store was called Safer Way. They founded it in 1978. Safer Way obviously was a critique of Safeway. It embedded in its very name was a criticism of supermarket chains, of industrial scale agribusiness. It was a vegetarian only store. It was in a Victorian 2-story house. It was not very polished, and it ended up closing after 2 years. Then Mackey thought, what I really want to do is I want to combine the natural food independent store with a supermarket. He had a few people to steal their ideas from. There was a place in Boston called Bread and Circus. Mm-hmm. And in Southern California, there was Mrs. Gooch's Natural Foods Marketplace or something like that. And these were essentially natural food supermarkets. But he stole that idea and ran with it. At the beginning, Whole Foods had things that most grocery chains didn't have. First of all, it was only one store. And then it was 2 stores. Maybe by the mid-'80s, it was half a dozen stores across Texas. But they had things like profit sharing for employees, which grocery stores don't typically have. They helped to organize environmental campaigns. They had an in-store newsletter where they urged people to write Congress and the White House about passing environmental legislation. In the 90s, however, Whole Foods moved away from that. John Mackey discovered libertarianism. John Mackey discovered making Whole Foods go public, selling Whole Foods on NASDAQ, and it became the first organic food seller to sell shares publicly. And so it underwent this big transformation, and what it did that really distinguished it is that it started gobbling up all these other natural food sellers, small regional chains. So it became something very different. It has always held on to this idea that it's kind of a countercultural employer. It was always proud that it didn't make people cut their hair short, or they didn't really have to wear uniforms, and, people could, men could have ponytails and wear earrings if they wanted to at a time where that was prohibited at most businesses. But they moved more and more away from the idea that organic food somehow was part of a collective movement. That's what libertarianism is really not about collective struggle, but rather individual gain, which I think is what it became. And then obviously being bought by Amazon.
Right.
And Jeff Bezos, another big time libertarian.
Yeah.
Has totally taken it away from that. But if you can still go into some Whole Food stores today. I remember I was in one in Chapel Hill in North Carolina. And I don't know if it's still this way, but as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, there was a timeline on the wall. And the timeline was a series of dates about organic food, but also the environmental movement. 1962, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. 1970, First Earth Day. 1970, a Clean Air and Water Act passed. 1980, the first Whole Foods opens. Like Whole Foods, until very, very recently, has told its history as part of the history of the environmental movement.
And it doesn't anymore?
I haven't looked at their website recently, but I would be surprised if they have taken that away. I imagine if you look at their website right now that it still gestures towards being part of the larger political environmental movement.
Yeah.
But as you said, I mean, it's basically made the cost of admission very low. And I don't mean in terms of the cost of the food, but you don't have to really give anything to shop at Whole Foods. You contrast that with Park Slope Food Co-op or any other co-op, right?
Yeah.
Because the connection between co-ops and natural foods was really tight. And in the 60s and 70s, for a lot of people, organic food meant this is food you have to work for, not only to necessarily farm, but through collective and cooperative economics, maybe we can leverage our power together to get this food very, very cheaply. Obviously, Whole Foods threw that out of the window, but you've still got some of these co-ops still doing big business around the country. Park Slope, I think, is, I'm pretty sure, the highest grossing food co-op in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I walked by the Park Slope food co-op a million times in my life, and it's a really funny place. I mean, there's a lot of class contradiction going on there. There's a lot of really intense politics even. I mean, they had a fight over BDS, like whether they were going to join the BDS movement at the Park Slope Food Co-op. And I'm pretty sure they rejected becoming part of BDS, but it was like an unbelievable fight. And it really like kind of brought out this idea that the co-op was at the center of, some of these major political questions in a way that I don't think you would see at Whole Foods because it's just a big corporation.
I mean, it's interesting, now all of the national chains, I mean, they always wanted to avoid politics, expressing them publicly, but now more than ever in the age of Trump, they're terrified of being seen as pro or anti Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Like not all businesses, but certainly some. They're terrified by being seen as either pro or anti-Trump. Natural foods co-ops, organic food sellers going back to the 60s were the exact opposite. They did what you just described, like Park Slope did with BDS. They love to have votes about, okay, are we going to boycott lettuce to support United Farm Workers? Yes or no? And are we going to boycott any Israeli products? Are we going to boycott this? Are we going to give 1 cent of every dollar to this? That was something they loved to do. And I think it's really, the co-ops do that less today, but they still engage in political issues, in shared collective political struggles in a way that Whole Foods never, ever would today, ever.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm thinking about our local, Ventura, California, and our local Google, our local big corporation is actually a company called Patagonia, which makes like outdoor gear and jackets, and they became really huge in the last several years. But they've been around for a long, long time, and their owners are big environmentalists. I mean, they're really famous environmentalists, and their whole thing is about environmentalism. But they also just got like some bad press because it got uncovered that they've been like providing, basically contracts with law enforcement around the country and military and selling like tactical gear, Patagonia tactical gear to the police. So like there was a little Black Lives Matter pushback. But none of it is like employees that are deciding this stuff. It's also, activism that's happening from outside the company. And it just makes me think about like, God, is it even possible to have an activist company like you're talking about at a level that's a huge corporation? Because it seems like once it gets to that level, that politics just gets kind of pushed to the side or watered down or dismissed or whatever. I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly.
And Patagonia, I actually hadn't heard that, but I mean, Patagonia is one of the better companies in terms of totally political engagement. I mean, they really have been one that has not been afraid at all to publicly criticize Trump. They have not been afraid historically to strongly advocate for environmental laws, not just kind of feel good, protect the birds and the water stuff, but they have not typically been afraid to do those things. I'm not saying they're perfect. I mean, Ben and Jerry's is another one where
that's right.
Ben and Jerry's is a rare company, and I believe they've been owned by Unilever for a while, but they still have a lot of control on the management level. And Ben and Jerry's is another rare national brand that embraces taking political stances, especially left political stances, in a way that's very, very rare otherwise. But again, I mean, be it Patagonia or Ben and Jerry's, one of the big parts of the story I wrote, I think, is that most of these activist businesses of the 60s and 70s ended up closing, but they had a very important intellectual and cultural legacy that lives on. Their ideas have been watered down for sure, but the popularity of ideas like social enterprise, conscious capitalism, which is pretty cliche, mission-driven business.
Yeah.
I would say of those three, social enterprise is the one that is most engaged in kind of collective struggle. But each of those ideas really draws heavily from these activist businesses of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Whether they know it or not, their language of liberation and social change through business is heavily indebted to the activist enterprises I looked at.
Yeah, I agree, and same here. I mean, it's weird because it's that impulse is still around, and you still see it, and you still kind of pick it up, especially in big cities. I mean, I was teaching at a school in Hollywood a couple years ago when this skate shop opened up called Fucking Awesome. And it's like a counterculture skate shop that I'm forgetting the name of the dude that opened it, but he's a big famous skater, and I sent my students over there and they came back and I said, "What'd you think?" And they said it was a really cool glossy store. It was very Banksy like, there was they actually have a police car, LAPD police car suspended upside down from the ceiling. Everything's behind glass, these amazing vintage skateboards. And what they had to say was everything was too expensive there. They're like, there wasn't a thing that was cheaper than $300 for a t-shirt. And it just felt like it wasn't for us at all. And so we looked at the stuff, we took pictures and put it on our Instagram because they had cool stuff. And then we left without buying anything because it just seemed like it wasn't for us. And I felt like even in that store, it's telling a little bit of the story of what you're setting up here of how things have changed over the time and what we might call counterculture. I
mean, it's the boutiqueification, really. I mean, I'm not going to say that all these activist businesses, the products they sold were always cheap. I mean, organic food was not cheap in the late 60s and 70s, but the glossiness, the polish, and the expensive kind of lifestyle products, that approach to something like organic food is much, much, much bigger than it was 40, 50 years ago. Kind of what you're talking about, where it's the people who were really part of the organic food movement in the 70s, and they really did think of themselves as a movement. Mm-hmm. You had to develop knowledge, understanding. You had to read books about nutrition. You had to read books about the environment. It was an educational process to become part of Natural Foods Co-op. It was a political education. Diet for a Lonely Planet was a huge bestseller. That's not around as much anymore. I think what's more comparable today is, I think for a lot of people who are vegan, that there still is a strong, strong sense of collective identity and of re-education, for lack of a better term, unlearning things you thought you knew about food and the environment and health, and going through kind of a bigger transformative process that isn't just popping into Whole Foods for 20 minutes and filling up your shopping cart really quickly. with like 150 bucks worth of stuff.
Yeah, like I think you got like 3 items for $150 at Whole Foods.
Right.
Josh Davis, thanks so much for joining us. I want to say the name of your book again because it's awesome. It's called From Head Shops to Whole Foods: The Rise and Fall of Activist Entrepreneurs, which is part of the Columbia Studies in the History of U.S. Capitalism. Really, really cool ideas. Thanks so much for sharing with me.
Yeah, thank you, David, for having me. This is great.
Okay, I want to give a big thank you to my guest, Josh Davis. Go get his book, From Head Shops to Whole Foods: The Rise and Fall of Activist Entrepreneurs. To me, it gave me a million things to think about, again, as we're moving into a very uncertain future, especially when it comes to brick and mortar stores. What opportunity might there be there? And I think Josh has a lot of really cool ideas. So thank you, Josh, for joining us. Thank you to all the people that support the show. If you want to get in on our conversations with Dan Bessner, we're talking about some freaky stuff over there. Go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and thank you a million times to the people who are already doing that. We love hearing from you, and we'll talk to you all very soon. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.